When a decorated soldier returns home to bury his past, he walks straight into a town ruled by fear and corruption. Powerful family owns the law, the land, and the people. But when they target the wrong man, the hunter becomes the hunted. As dark secrets explode into the light, one soldier's fight for truth ignites a war that Ashridge will never forget. Get ready for a story that'll pull you in so deep, you won't be able to walk away. This is not just a tale, it's an experience you'll feel. So before we begin, hit subscribe to Black Battles, where every story hits harder than truth itself. The road into Ashridge, Alabama, stretched like a scar through the pine woods. Long, cracked, and half-forgotten. Captain Ethan Ward hadn't driven it in 15 years. The town he left behind was already dying then. Its factories closed, its streets hollow, its people surviving on memory more than hope. But now, as his truck rolled through the rusted "Welcome to Ashridge" sign, he realized death had finally finished its work. Boarded storefronts lined Main Street. The diner where his father once bought him pie was now a pawn shop. The old movie theater's marquee still read, "Coming soon." It had been said that for decades, Ethan slowed to a stop near the courthouse square. The statue in the center, once a proud Civil War soldier, was coated in grime and bird droppings. Beside it, a new banner flapped lazily in the wind. "Rebuild Ashridge, sponsored by Iron Veil Industries." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had seen that name before, on trucks, contracts, and oil drums in war zones. Iron Veil never built anything without destroying something else first. He parked by the curb and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. For a moment he just stood there, breathing in the stillness, the scent of pine, dust, and the faint tang of diesel. It wasn't home anymore. It was a ghost with his father's voice. Inside the Ashridge Bar and Grill, time had stopped somewhere between the 1970s and a bad dream. The jukebox was broken. A neon beer sign flickered weakly above the counter. It used to be Ward's Tavern, owned by Ethan's grandfather, a place where working men came after church, where laughter drowned out pain. Now it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't understand what the place meant. Ethan took a stool in the corner, his back against the wall. He ordered black coffee. The bartender, a thin man with tattoos crawling up his neck, didn't recognize him. Across the room, a group of young men laughed too loudly, their words sharp and mean. One of them, tall with a Confederate flag patch on his jacket, shoved a black teenager against the wall. "Hey," he sneered, "you don't belong here." The bar went silent. Ethan's hand tightened around his mug. He didn't want trouble, not tonight. But when the boy tried to pull away and the man raised his hand again, something old and hard inside Ethan snapped awake. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the room. "Let him go," he said quietly. The tall man, Caleb Hawthorne, turned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, look who's talking. You lost, old man." The others laughed. Ethan didn't move. His eyes were steady, soldier's eyes, the kind that made even reckless men hesitate. Caleb's grin faltered. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Ethan stepped closer, voice calm but cutting. "Doesn't matter who you are. What matters is you're done." Before anyone could blink, Caleb swung. Ethan blocked, twisted, and in a single motion, the man's wrist hit the counter with a sharp crack. The bar erupted, chairs scraping, curses flying, until someone shouted, "That's Caleb Hawthorne." The name hit the room like a gunshot. Ethan froze. Hawthorne, the name every Ashridge resident knew. The family that owned the sheriff's office, the banks, and half the town. And now, apparently, this bar. The bartender moved fast, muttering, "You better get out of here, stranger. You don't want to start nothing with him." Ethan picked up his jacket, tossed a bill on the counter, and walked out into the cold night air. His heart was steady, but his mind was racing. He hadn't meant to start anything. But in Ashridge, some fires didn't need gasoline. Just a spark. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof of his truck. He sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield, watching the raindrops chase one another down the glass. He could leave now, drive back to the life he'd built, the quiet, empty cabin in North Carolina where nobody knew his name. But something inside him wouldn't let him. When he was a boy, his father told him, "The Wards built this town with calloused hands and honest hearts. Don't ever let anyone take that from you. He had failed that promise once. He wouldn't do it again. Ethan started the engine and drove to the edge of town, where his family's land used to be. A stretch of pasture now fenced with Iron Vale's signs. Private property, no trespassing. His headlights caught the reflection of a security camera on a pole, red light blinking in the dark. They were watching. He stepped out into the rain, his boots sinking into the mud. The old barn was gone. The oak tree where his father carved their family initials, cut down. In its place stood a metal storage tank marked with toxic warnings. Ethan's fists clenched. The war he thought he'd left behind had been waiting for him right here, buried beneath Ashridge's polite silence. As thunder rolled across the hills, he whispered almost to himself, "This time, I'm not walking away." Far off, in a dark mansion at the end of Hawthorne Lane, Richard Hawthorne watched a security feed flicker to life, showing Ethan Ward standing on the old Ward property. A slow smile crept across his face. "Well," he murmured, "these soldiers come home." Outside, the storm gathered strength, and Ashridge held its breath. The past had returned, and this time it wanted answers. Morning camagray and heavy over Ashridge. The rain hadn't stopped. It had only changed rhythm, falling in slow, deliberate drops that seemed to echo off every empty porch and forgotten storefront. Captain Ethan Ward hadn't slept. He'd spent the night driving the outskirts of town, circling the roads that used to lead to farms and homes, now fenced off and marked with Iron Vale Industries signs. It wasn't just his family's land that was gone. Whole neighborhoods had vanished, swallowed by the same company logo stamped in steel and concrete. By sunrise, he parked outside the Ashridge Gazette, a fading two-story brick building downtown. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see a woman typing fast at her desk and stacks of files and coffee cups surrounding her like a small fortress. That was Sarah Bennett. He'd read her name years ago in a national piece about corruption in a southern police department. Her writing was sharp, fearless, the kind that made enemies in powerful places. He hadn't expected to find her in a forgotten Alabama town. Ethan stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed weakly. Sarah looked up, her green eyes cautious but curious. "We're closed," she said, her voice firm but tired. "I'm not here for a subscription," Ethan replied. "I'm here for the truth." She studied him for a long moment. He looked like trouble, worn boots, a military jacket, and eyes that had seen too much. The kind of man who carried silence like a weapon. "Everyone says that," she said, leaning back in her chair. "The truth. But they only want the version that fits their story. Which one's yours?" Ethan dropped a small mud-stained photo on her desk, his father standing beside the old barn, smiling. "This land, Ward Farm, Iron Vale owns it now. They didn't buy it, they took it." Sarah's expression shifted. She recognized the name. "I've been looking into Iron Vale for 2 years," she said slowly. "Land seizures, bribes, missing permits. But every time I get close, files disappear. People stop talking, or end up dead." Ethan asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Ethan pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his pocket. The headline read, "Local man found dead in apparent suicide." The photo was of a young black man, someone Ethan recognized vaguely from town. Sarah's eyes softened. "That's Marcus Hale. He worked at the Iron Vale plant. Reported a chemical leak 3 months ago. The next week he shot himself. Only problem is, his fingerprints weren't on the gun." Ethan's voice dropped. "You have proof?" "Not yet," she said. "But I have something better. A witness." They drove together through the rain to the edge of town, where an old church stood crooked under the weight of years. The sign read, "New Hope Baptist, Reverend Elijah Brooks." Inside, the air smelled of dust and candle wax. Reverend Elijah Brooks, a tall man with gray in his beard and pain in his eyes, greeted them quietly. "I remember you," he said to Ethan. "You were just a boy when your father brought you here." Ethan nodded. "And you buried him, Reverend." "You told me the land would heal one day," Elijah sighed. "Land can heal, son. But only if the poison's gone." Sarah opened her notebook. "Reverend, you said you've been keeping records?" Elijah led them to a small office. He unlocked an old metal cabinet. Inside were boxes of handwritten journals, photos, and police reports, each labeled by year. I started documenting 30 years ago, he said. Every black man who went missing. Every family was forced off their land. Every suicide that never made sense. He handed Sarah a file. That one's from '96, a farmer named Henry Ward. Ethan froze. My uncle. Elijah nodded sadly. He didn't take his own life, Ethan. He found out that the Hawthorns were selling stolen farmland to Ironvale. He planned to expose them. He never got the chance. Ethan felt the room spin. The pieces were aligning. His family, the Hawthorns, Ironvale, decades of silence. Sarah flipped through the files, her hands trembling. This isn't just corruption. This is organized theft covered by murder. And the police? Ethan asked. Elijah's face hardened. The sheriff's office is the Hawthorns. Buck Hawthorne runs the law here. His son Caleb enforces it. They think this town belongs to them. Ethan clenched his jaw. Last night I met Caleb. Sarah looked up sharply. What happened? He tried to hurt someone. I stopped him. Elijah stared at him, concern flickering in his eyes. Then you've already drawn blood, son. They'll come for you now. Ethan didn't respond. He was staring at the rain sliding down the church window, each drop carrying reflections of a town drowning in its own secrets. As they left the church, Sarah glanced at him. If we do this, if we expose them, we'll be targets. I've been a target before, he said quietly. Maybe, she replied, but this isn't a battlefield. This is their world, and they play dirty. Ethan looked toward the horizon where Ironvale's smokestacks bled black clouds into the gray sky. Then it's time someone fought dirtier. Sarah almost smiled, though fear lingered behind her eyes. I'll get my equipment, recorders, cameras. If we can catch them talking, admitting what they've done. They'll burn, Ethan finished. As they parted ways for the night, the church bell tolled faintly behind them. Somewhere deep in the woods, thunder rolled. Not from the storm this time, but from something else moving in the darkness. In the Hawthorne estate, Caleb nursed his bandaged wrist, watching the rain outside his window. Who is he, Pa? He asked. Richard Hawthorne didn't look up from his glass of bourbon. A soldier without a war, he said. Let's give him one. Outside. The thunder grew louder. Ashridge wasn't just haunted by its past anymore. It was preparing for war. The next few days in Ashridge passed under a strange silence, the kind that comes before something breaks. The rain had stopped, but the air stayed thick and heavy, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Captain Ethan Ward spent his mornings walking the old streets, learning what had changed and what had not. The same faces stared from behind curtains. The same whispers followed him down Main Street. People remembered the Wards. They just didn't say it out loud. Ironvale trucks rumbled past every hour, their black smoke curling through the cracked air. Every logo he saw felt like a wound reopened. By noon, he met Sarah Bennett again, this time in a quiet diner off Highway 12. The sign outside read Maggie's Place, though the neon P had burned out years ago. Sarah sat in the back booth, her laptop open, headphones around her neck, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. The glow of the screen reflected off her face, highlighting the exhaustion beneath her determination. I cross-checked Reverend Elijah's files, she said without looking up. Dozens of disappearances, all tied to land that Ironvale now owns. They didn't buy those properties. They inherited them after suicides and foreclosures. Ethan slid into the booth across from her. And the Hawthorns? She sighed. Their names are all over the paperwork. They signed approvals, handled transactions, and even falsified property surveys. But the evidence isn't enough for the court. We need their voices, their confessions. Ethan leaned forward. Then we record them. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You make it sound simple. He smiled faintly. It's never simple, but it's possible. That afternoon they met Reverend Elijah Brooks at the church again. His office smelled of rain-soaked paper and candle wax. On the desk sat a small box of equipment. Recorders, wireless transmitters, and a used laptop. I had these left from the days we monitored town meetings, Elijah said. Back when people still cared about what was said. Ethan examined the gear. It'll do. Sarah checked the transmitters. If we hide these inside the bar, near where Caleb and his crew hang out, We could get hours of footage. They brag when they drink, Elijah frowned. That's dangerous. If they catch you, they won't, Ethan interrupted. His tone was calm but resolute, the kind that came from years of walking into fire and coming back out. That night, Ashridge Bar and Grill was alive again. Laughter too loud, country music humming from a cracked speaker, and smoke thick enough to choke the truth. Caleb Hawthorne sat at the center table, surrounded by his friends, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Ethan and Sarah entered quietly. He wore a ball cap low over his eyes. She carried a camera bag slung over her shoulder. To anyone watching, they looked like strangers just passing through. The bartender recognized Ethan but said nothing. Fear made people mute in Ashridge. As Sarah ordered drinks, Ethan moved through the shadows, his movements deliberate, practiced. He slid a recorder under a table leg near Caleb's group, another behind the jukebox. Each one blinked green. Recording. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pretended to check her phone. The memory of Marcus Hale's face, the young man killed for speaking up, burned in her mind. She glanced toward Caleb's table just as one of his friends said, "Can't believe the old man bought it." Another one down, Caleb smirked. "Ain't no one gonna miss him. That land's Iron Vale's now. Dad says it's all part of the plan." The men laughed, clinking their glasses together. Sarah's heart pounded. She knew what she was hearing. A confession wrapped in arrogance. But then Caleb's eyes lifted, landing directly on her. He smiled. Cold, calculating. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said, his voice carrying across the bar. Ethan turned, stepping slightly between them. "We're just passing through." Caleb rose from his chair, slow and deliberate. "You again," he said, recognition dawning. The soldier. The bar went still. Even the jukebox stopped mid-song. Ethan's voice stayed low. "Sit down, Caleb." But Caleb didn't. He stepped closer until they were face to face. "You broke my wrist." "You were hurting a kid," Ethan replied. Caleb's lip curled. "You think you can walk into my bar, into my town, and play hero?" Ethan's tone was steel. "No, I'm just reminding you what a man looks like." Caleb's fist came up fast, but Ethan was faster. He sidestepped, caught his arm, and pinned him against the counter before anyone could react. The room erupted, shouts, chaos, and then the sheriff's deputies burst through the door. "Enough," one of them yelled. It was Sheriff Buck Hawthorne himself, tall, broad, with eyes like winter. He scanned the room, then landed on Ethan. "You're making a lot of noise for someone who doesn't belong here." Ethan released Caleb slowly. "Just defending myself." Buck smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got two choices, soldier. Leave town, or I'll find a reason to bury you in it." Ethan said nothing. Sarah held her breath, clutching her camera bag. Inside it, the recorders were still running. Buck gestured toward the door. "Get out." Ethan and Sarah walked out into the cool night, the sheriff's gaze following them until they disappeared into the shadows. A mile away, inside the truck, Sarah played back the recording. Static filled the speakers, then Caleb's voice came through. Clear, arrogant, undeniable. "That land's Iron Vale's now. Dad says it's all part of the plan." Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's it, proof." "Not enough," Sarah said softly. "We need more. Something that ties Buck and Iron Vale together." Ethan looked out toward the distant glow of the refinery's lights. "Then that's where we go next." Sarah glanced at him, her voice low. "Do you realize we just painted a target on our backs?" Ethan's eyes were steady, reflecting the road ahead. "Then let them aim." In the Hawthorne mansion, Caleb paced furiously while Buck poured himself another drink. "You should have let me finish him," Caleb hissed. Buck's voice was calm, almost cold. "No, let him think he's safe. Men like Ward always dig their own graves. We'll just hand him the shovel." Outside, lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the Iron Vale refinery in the distance, its towers glowing like beacons in the dark. The storm had gathered, and this time, Ashridge wouldn't survive it quietly. The night over Ashridge was unnaturally quiet. The storm clouds had drifted north, leaving behind a heavy stillness, the kind that made even the crickets stop singing. Far out on the edge of town, the Iron Vale refinery glowed like a wound in the darkness, its towers exhaling smoke that shimmered red under the floodlights. Captain Ethan Ward parked his truck behind a row of dead pine trees. Beside him, Sarah Bennett checked the last of her equipment. A camera strapped to her vest, a flashlight taped with red film to keep the glow dim. "You sure about this?" she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "If we want proof, it's inside those gates." Sarah swallowed hard, glancing at the massive refinery. "I've broken into places before, Ethan, but this is a fortress." He gave her a faint, grim smile. "Then we move like ghosts." They crossed the field, their boots silent in the wet grass. The hum of machines grew louder, vibrating through the ground. Floodlights swept over the yard like the eyes of a predator. At the fence line, Ethan cut through a section of wire and motioned her forward. Inside, the air smelled of burning chemicals and rust. A low, constant hiss came from deep within the refinery, like the earth itself was bleeding. They found a small operations building at the far end of the compound. Steel walls, one window, a locked door. Ethan picked the lock in seconds. Inside, the flicker of computer monitors bathed the room in pale green light. Sarah sat down, fingers flying across the keyboard. "These are environmental logs," she murmured. "Chemical output, waste disposal. But none of it makes sense. The dates are falsified. The leaks Reverend Elijah mentioned, they were buried under fake reports." Ethan scanned the walls, framed photographs of smiling executives shaking hands with politicians. At the center was one that made him stop. It showed Richard Hawthorne standing beside a man in a gray suit. Underneath, the plaque read, "Partnership Ceremony, Iron Veil Industries, 1996. Ethan's pulse quickened. He's not just working with them. He's been part of it since the beginning. Sarah looked up. "That's almost 30 years. They've been poisoning this town for decades." She opened another file. "Look at this, employee death reports. They all say industrial accident, but the toxicology tests were altered. These people didn't just die. They were exposed, intentionally." Ethan's fists clenched, and the sheriff covered it up. Before Sarah could respond, a low rumble echoed outside, the sound of a vehicle approaching. Headlights flashed through the window. "Someone's here," Ethan whispered. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back door. They slipped out just as a black SUV rolled to a stop near the building. Two men stepped out, both armed, both wearing Iron Veil security uniforms. Sarah pressed her back against the wall, breath shaking. "What do we do?" Ethan's voice was steady. "We wait." The guards entered the building. Their voices carried through the thin metal. "Boss says the files need to be wiped tonight," one said. "Too many eyes on us after that fight at the bar." Sarah looked at Ethan, her eyes wide. "They know." Ethan motioned for silence. The guards walked back out minutes later, one of them lighting a cigarette. Ethan moved fast, silent as smoke, striking from behind. One guard went down unconscious. The other turned, hand reaching for his gun, but Ethan was faster. A sharp twist, a low grunt, and he was out cold. Sarah stared, shaken but composed. "You move like you've done this before." Ethan didn't answer. He picked up one of the radios from the fallen guard. Voices crackled through. "Patrol 7, check in. North perimeter clear?" He turned the dial off. "We need to move." They made their way deeper into the refinery. The air grew hotter, filled with the metallic tang of oil and fire. In the distance, massive storage tanks loomed, pipes hissing steam. They ducked into a maintenance tunnel and found another locked door labeled Restricted Biohazard Containment. Sarah stared. "Biohazard? What are they hiding here?" Ethan pried open the panel. Inside were rows of barrels, some cracked, others leaking dark sludge that reeked of chemicals. Each barrel bore the Iron Veil logo and a faded sticker. "Ward Property, 1984. Sarah's voice trembled. "That's your family's land." Ethan's throat tightened. "They didn't just steal it. They used it as a dumping ground." He stared at the barrels, at the slow drip of black poison seeping into the earth. The truth was worse than he'd imagined. This wasn't just corruption. It was murder. Of land, of people, of generations. Sarah whispered, This is the story. We expose this and Iron Veil falls." But before Ethan could reply, an alarm blared through the facility. Red lights flashed overhead. A voice over the loudspeaker shouted, "Unauthorized access detected. All units respond to Sector 5. Ethan cursed under his breath. They found the bodies. "Now what?" Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. He grabbed her hand. "Now we run." They sprinted through the tunnel as footsteps thundered behind them. Bullets sparked against the steel walls. Ethan turned a corner, fired a warning shot from the pistol he'd taken, and smashed open a side exit. Outside, the night had turned to fire. The refinery lights blazed red, alarms echoing into the hills. Sarah stumbled into the open air, clutching her camera to her chest. "Did you get the footage?" Ethan asked. She nodded breathlessly. "Every second." "Good," he said. "Then we've already won." A spotlight swung toward them. Ethan grabbed her and dove behind a row of barrels. Engines roared. More trucks coming. Sarah's voice broke. "They'll kill us, not tonight," Ethan said. "We still have the truth." They disappeared into the woods as the refinery burned behind them, fire licking at the sky like vengeance long delayed. From a distant hill, Reverend Elijah watched the smoke rising. He clutched his worn Bible to his chest, whispering a prayer. In the Hawthorne mansion, Richard poured himself another drink, his hands steady. Caleb burst into the room, wild-eyed. They broke in. They saw everything. Richard turned slowly, his voice quiet but deadly. "Then it's time we clean house. Start with the journalist," Caleb grinned. "And the soldier?" Richard's cold smile widened. "He'll come for us, let him. I want to see how far a ghost will go before he burns." Outside, thunder rolled again, this time from the fire-consuming Iron Vale's lies. Ashridge was awake now, and there was no going back. The morning after the Iron Vale explosion, Ashridge looked like a war zone. Black smoke still hung low over the horizon, staining the sunrise. Sirens wailed in the distance, and local news vans lined the streets outside the refinery gates. Reporters shouted questions no one dared answer. Ethan Ward stood on a ridge overlooking the town, his eyes hollow but burning with determination. His jacket was torn, his knuckles bruised, and the memory of last night still clawed at him. The gunfire, the fire, the sound of Sarah's breath beside him as they ran. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small flash drive Sarah had given him before they split up. "This has everything," she'd said. "If anything happens to me, you take it to Reverend Elijah." Ethan hadn't seen her since. He gripped the drive tightly, then started down the dirt path toward the old church that sat on the edge of town, St. Mary's Chapel, where Reverend Elijah Moore had served for 40 years. Inside, sunlight filtered through cracked stained glass windows, painting fractured rainbows on the pews. Elijah was already waiting, his Bible open on the altar. "You look like you've been through hell," the Reverend said softly. "I have," Ethan replied, handing him the flash drive. "This is the truth, Reverend. Iron Vale, the Hawthorns, everything." Elijah turned it over in his hands, his eyes heavy. "Then the devil's work finally has a face." Ethan leaned on the pew, his voice low. "Sarah was supposed to meet me here. She never showed." Elijah's brow furrowed. "She wouldn't vanish willingly." Before Ethan could answer, the church doors creaked open. A young deputy stood there, hat in hand, face pale. "Captain Ward," he said nervously, "you'd better come with me. We found something you'll want to see." They drove out to a clearing by the river, a place Ethan knew all too well. It was where his father used to take him fishing before the land was seized. Now it was a dumping ground. Blackened soil, oil stains, the stench of rot. The deputy pointed toward a burned-out car near the water line. "We found this early this morning. Belongs to Sarah Bennett." Ethan's chest tightened. He moved closer, pushing through the smoke and ashes. The car's frame was twisted, the interior scorched. On the ground nearby lay her press badge, half melted but still legible. He sank to one knee, his hand trembling as he picked it up. No, she wouldn't." The deputy's voice was quiet. "Nobody, sir." But there were signs of a struggle. Blood on the ground. "Tracks heading north." Ethan's jaw clenched. "They took her alive." Reverend Elijah laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then she still has a chance. But so do they, to finish what they started." That night, Ashridge felt suffocated by fear. Sheriff's patrols doubled. Roadblocks went up, and anyone who asked questions was quietly silenced. On the local news, Mayor Hawthorne appeared calm and calculated, claiming the Iron Vale fire was a tragic accident. But Ethan knew better. Behind that polished speech was a man desperate to hide his sins. He sat inside the church basement with Elijah, poring over the files from Sarah's drive. The evidence was explosive. Photos, documents, recorded calls. Iron Vale had been paying off the sheriff's department for years. Land was stolen, black families forced out, and environmental crimes disguised as industrial upgrades. And at the center of it all, Richard Hawthorne. And the very sheriff meant to protect the people. Elijah's voice trembled as he read a report. They poisoned the soil under your father's farm, Ethan. That's why your crops failed. That's why he lost everything. Ethan closed his eyes, and when he tried to fight back, they called it suicide. The Reverend looked up, eyes glistening. They didn't just steal from you. They stole the spirit of this whole town. Ethan stood. Then it's time we take it back. Late that night, he drove alone to the Hawthorne estate, a sprawling mansion hidden behind iron gates and oak trees. The place looked peaceful, but Ethan knew it was anything but. He parked his truck down the hill, slipped through the trees, and approached the back entrance. He'd been trained for infiltration. But this time, it wasn't war. It was vengeance wrapped in justice. Through the window, he saw Richard Hawthorne sitting at his desk, sipping whiskey. His son Caleb pacing beside him. We've contained the situation, Caleb said. If that reporter talks, she dies before she reaches a microphone. Richard didn't look up. And Ward? Caleb smirked. We'll find him. Ethan stepped back, his pulse racing. Sarah's alive. He turned and slipped away, back into the shadows, his mind already working a plan. By dawn, he was back at the church. Elijah was waiting, worried. Did you find her? Not yet, Ethan said. But I know where she is, the old quarry. That's where they're keeping her. Elijah frowned. That place was sealed off years ago, dangerous. Ethan loaded his weapon. So are they. Elijah touched his arm. Ethan, revenge won't heal what they broke. Justice will. Ethan's voice softened. Then I'll bring both. He handed Elijah a folder. If I don't make it back, give this to the feds. It's everything. Promise me. The Reverend's eyes filled with tears. I promise, son. Ethan looked toward the rising sun, the same sun that had once shone over the fields his father lost. Now it felt like a reckoning. He got in his truck and drove toward the quarry, dust spiraling behind him, his heart heavy but unyielding, because in Ashridge, truth came at a price. And Ethan Ward was ready to pay it in full. The sun bled into the horizon as Ethan Ward's truck rumbled down the dirt road toward the old quarry. The once bustling site had long been abandoned, a scar in the earth surrounded by cliffs and jagged machinery left to rust. Locals whispered about strange noises at night, about trucks that came and went without headlights. Now Ethan knew why. He killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled of dust and oil. A faint hum echoed from deep within the pit, where floodlights illuminated makeshift buildings and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Sarah's here, he muttered. He adjusted his gear, a pistol holstered to his leg, a knife strapped beneath his sleeve, and a flashlight taped to his vest. Every instinct in his body was alive again, the old soldier buried beneath years of peace. But this wasn't a mission for the military. It was personal. Moving low between boulders, Ethan surveyed the compound. 2 trucks idled near the quarry floor, their engines running. A chain-link fence surrounded the main warehouse. Through the cracks, he saw movement. A woman tied to a chair. Her face bruised but defiant. Sarah, Ethan's heart tightened. Relief, rage, fear, all at once. 2 guards stood nearby, laughing as they smoked. Another circled the building with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Ethan waited for the right moment, then threw a small rock toward a distant barrel. The noise echoed. The nearest guard turned his head. What the hell was that? Ethan moved like a shadow, grabbing the man from behind and silencing him with swift precision. He dragged the body behind a crate and crept closer to the warehouse door. Inside, Caleb Hawthorne paced back and forth, a gun in one hand, a cruel smirk twisting his face. You thought you could expose us, sweetheart. He sneered at Sarah. You journalists always think truth wins. But in this town, power wins. My family made sure of that. Sarah's voice was hoarse but fearless. Your power's built on poison, Caleb, and it's crumbling. Caleb's smirk faded. He crouched beside her, gripping her chin. Maybe, but you won't live to see it. He raised his gun. The door burst open. Ethan moved fast, his pistol drawn. Drop it! Caleb froze, his expression morphing from arrogance to shock. You, Sarah's eyes widened. Ethan. Ethan fired first, a clean shot that shattered the light above Caleb's head, plunging the room into flickering chaos. He tackled Caleb to the ground, the gun clattering away. The two men struggled in the dust, fists and rage colliding. Caleb swung wildly. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Ethan gritted his teeth, blocking a blow. "No, just the end of your story." He slammed Caleb's head against the floor, knocking him out cold. Breathing hard, Ethan rushed to Sarah and untied her ropes. She fell into his arms, trembling. "You came," he smiled faintly. "Told you I would." But their moment of relief was short-lived. Outside, engines roared. Floodlights blazed through the broken windows. Dozens of men were arriving. "They know you're here," Sarah whispered. Ethan helped her stand. "Then we finish this." He guided her toward the exit, but gunfire erupted before they reached the door. Bullets tore through the walls, sending splinters flying. Ethan pulled Sarah behind a steel column. "We're pinned," she said, clutching his arm. Ethan peeked out. At least 10 men surrounded the building, firing from all angles. He spotted a truck parked near the quarry edge, its engine running. "If we can reach that truck, we're out." Sarah frowned. "That's a big if," he smiled grimly. "Then we make it bigger." From his vest, Ethan pulled a small smoke grenade, a leftover from his Delta Force days, something he kept for when things went bad. He yanked the pin and tossed it toward the front. The explosion filled the air with thick gray smoke. Chaos erupted as guards shouted and coughed. Ethan grabbed Sarah's hand. "Now!" They sprinted through the haze, dodging gunfire and debris. Ethan fired back, dropping 2 men. The truck came into view, but as they neared it, a figure stepped into their path. Richard Hawthorne. The patriarch of Ashridge stood there, calm, collected, holding a shotgun like it was an extension of his will. "I warned you." "Ward," he said, voice cold as steel. "You should have stayed gone." Ethan raised his pistol. "And let you keep poisoning this town?" Richard cocked the shotgun. "This town is mine. My father built it, and I'll bury anyone who threatens it." Sarah stepped forward despite her trembling. "Your father built nothing but graves," Richard sneered. "And you'll join them." He fired, the blast deafening in the open air. Ethan dove, pulling Sarah down as the shot tore through the truck's windshield. He rolled, aimed, and shot back, hitting Richard's shoulder. The old man staggered, dropping his gun. Ethan approached slowly, gun still raised. "It's over." Richard laughed, blood staining his shirt. "You think killing me changes anything?" "The Hawthorns own this town. Always have. Always will." Ethan's voice was low, deadly calm. "Not anymore." Behind him, sirens echoed. Not the sheriffs, but federal agents, their vehicles racing down the road. Reverend Elijah had done it. He'd sent the evidence. Richard looked toward the flashing lights, realization dawning in his fading eyes. Ethan stepped back. "Justice doesn't die easily, Richard." "But it's coming." The old man collapsed, the shotgun slipping from his hand. Minutes later, the quarry was swarming with federal agents. Sarah sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a blanket around her shoulders, watching as officers cuffed Caleb and loaded him into a truck. Ethan stood nearby. "Silent, you saved me," Sarah said softly. He shook his head. "You saved the truth," she smiled faintly. "So, what now?" Ethan looked out at the horizon. "Now the real fight begins. Cleaning up the rot, healing what's left." Reverend Elijah arrived, his coat flapping in the wind, a gentle pride in his eyes. "The people are waking up, Ethan. They're ready to stand." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then maybe Ashridge still has a future." As dawn broke over the quarry, light spilt across the wreckage, soft, golden, forgiving. The smoke was gone, replaced by the first calm breeze in years. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to breathe, because though the war for Ashridge was far from over, the truth, at long last, was free. 2 weeks after the night of fire, Ashridge began to breathe again. The refinery was silent, its gates locked, its towers dismantled under federal order. News vans still came and went, filming the cleanup, interviewing tearful locals who had lived under the Hawthorne shadow for generations. For the first time in decades, people walked the streets without fear of the sheriff's badge or the men who used it as a weapon. The empire of silence had fallen, but victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like mourning. Captain Ethan Ward stood at the edge of the old quarry, now flooded with rainwater and sunlight. The last place of violence had turned into something strangely peaceful, almost holy. He stared at the reflection of the sky in the still water and whispered, "Dad, it's over." The wind carried his words across the valley like a prayer. The days that followed were a blur of statements, trials, and endless questions. Richard Hawthorne had died from his wounds before he could stand trial. His son Caleb faced charges for kidnapping, attempted murder, and environmental crimes. Dozens of officers were suspended or arrested, their decades of corruption exposed in one sweeping federal investigation. But the damage ran deeper than paper crimes. Generations of black families had lost their homes, their land, their faith in justice. Now, slowly, they were reclaiming it. Reverend Elijah Moore became the voice of that recovery. His church, once half empty, now overflowed with people seeking more than forgiveness, seeking direction. He stood before his congregation one Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through the repaired stained glass windows, and said, "Truth isn't a weapon to destroy, it's a light to rebuild." And in the back row, Ethan sat quietly beside Sarah Bennett, who recorded every word for her final article, "The Town That Rose from Shadows." Later, as the service ended, Sarah turned to him. "You know, people are calling you a hero." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Heroes don't feel this tired." She studied his face. "You're leaving, aren't you?" He nodded slowly. "I've done what I came here to do. The rest belongs to them now." Sarah's voice softened. "And what about you? Where do you go when the ghosts are gone?" He looked toward the church doors where sunlight cut through like a golden blade. "Maybe I will finally stop running." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Before you disappear into the wind, read this." It was her article, raw, unedited. The headline read, "The Soldier Who Fought the Quiet War." He read in silence for a while, eyes tracing her words, words that captured every ounce of pain, defiance, and redemption the town had endured. When he finished, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You gave them a voice," she smiled. "No, you did. I just made sure the world heard it." That afternoon, Ethan drove out past the ruins of the old Ward farm, the land his father had once tended before Ironvale poisoned the soil. The federal agents had already started soil restoration. Signs read, "Environmental Recovery Project, Future Community Land." He stopped by the old oak tree near the fence line, the one that had survived everything: storms, fire, and the slow death of neglect. Beneath it lay a small wooden box, weathered but intact. Inside were photographs, his parents, his childhood home, a medal from his days in Delta Force, relics of a life that felt like someone else's story. Ethan placed the box on the ground, covered it with soil, and whispered, "Rest now." He stood for a long time, letting the silence settle. It wasn't grief anymore. It was peace. As the sun dipped low, he met Sarah one last time at the edge of town. Her car was loaded with equipment, ready to drive north. Her story had gone national, and new doors awaited her. "You sure you don't want to come with me?" she asked. "DC could use someone like you." Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "No, I think Ashridge still needs someone like me, someone who remembers what it took to rebuild." Sarah sighed, her eyes glistening. "Then promise me you won't disappear again." He nodded. "You'll know where to find me, right where it all began." They hugged, long and silent. For two people who had fought through fire and fear, words weren't enough. When she finally drove away, her taillights fading into the distance, Ethan turned toward the town bathed in the last light of day. Weeks passed. Federal reform teams arrived. The new sheriff was sworn in, a woman who had once been fired for standing up to Buck Harland. She reinstated officers of integrity, reopened old cases, and created a department built on transparency. Reverend Elijah worked with the community to reclaim stolen land. Local farmers returned, rebuilding homes, planting crops in the ground once thought cursed. And slowly, the fields began to green again. Everywhere Ethan walked, people greeted him with nods, handshakes, and quiet gratitude. But he never stayed long in one place. He fixed fences, helped rebuild houses, and coached children at the community center. He never sought recognition, because heroes weren't meant to be remembered in statues. They were meant to be felt in the hearts they helped heal. One cool evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Ethan stood outside St. Mary's Chapel. Reverend Elijah approached, cane in hand, a knowing smile on his face. "You've done good work, son," the Reverend said. "Ashridge is standing again." Ethan looked out toward the glowing town lights. "Not because of me," Elijah chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but you reminded us what standing looks like." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sky fade from orange to violet. "Leaving tonight?" Elijah asked. Ethan nodded. "There's a Veterans Foundation upstate. They help rebuild towns hit by corporate corruption. Feels like the right next step." Elijah laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then go with peace. And remember, even shadows can't exist without light." Ethan smiled, his voice quiet. "That's what I've learned here." The next morning, his truck disappeared down the same road he'd arrived on months ago. The fields glowed green, the church bell rang, and children's laughter echoed in the streets once ruled by fear. Ashridge had changed, not just in its buildings, but in its soul. And though Ethan Ward was gone, his spirit lingered in every sunrise, every prayer whispered from the church steps, every seed planted in renewed soil, because the war for truth had ended, and from the ashes, something pure had taken root. As the first light of dawn spread across the valley, Reverend Elijah's Sunday sermon echoed through the air, his voice carrying across the fields. "In every town buried by darkness, there comes a day when light finds its way home. And somewhere on a distant road," Ethan whispered to the wind, "light always finds a way." The end.